The morning mist still clung to the Montana plains when Clayton Murdoch heard the thud against his front door. It wasn't the familiar sound of a package delivery or a neighbor's knock. It was the hollow sound of something heavy hitting wood and sliding down. When he opened the door, expecting to find a wounded animal or fallen branch, he discovered a woman collapsed on his weathered porch, her frail body barely moving with shallow breaths. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Clayton didn't know was that this mysterious woman carried with her a leather-bound diary that would unravel decades of lies, expose a conspiracy that had destroyed countless lives, and force him to confront the darkest chapter of his own family's history. Clayton Murdoch had lived alone on the Broken Arrow Ranch for the better part of 15 years. The 3,000-acre spread in the shadow of the Beartooth Mountains had been in his family for 4 generations, passed down from his great-grandfather who'd claimed the land during the Homestead Rush of 1889. Now, at 52, Clayton worked the ranch with the help of 2 part-time hands, raising cattle and maintaining the legacy his ancestors had built with calloused hands and stubborn determination. The ranch house itself was a testament to frontier craftsmanship, 2 stories of hand-hewn logs and native stone, with a wraparound porch that offered views of the rolling grasslands stretching toward the distant peaks. Clayton had inherited more than just the land. He'd inherited the solitude that came with it. His ex-wife Sarah had left 8 years prior, claiming she couldn't handle the isolation and his unwillingness to sell the ranch for a more comfortable life in Billings. Their divorce had been amicable enough, but it left Clayton with an empty house and a determination to prove that some things were worth preserving, even if it meant preserving them alone. The woman on his porch appeared to be in her early 60s, though malnutrition had aged her beyond her years. Her clothes were clean but threadbare, a faded blue dress that had seen better decades, and worn leather shoes with holes near the toes. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun despite her condition, suggesting she'd maintained her dignity even as her body failed her. Most striking were her hands, elegant fingers that spoke of a genteel upbringing, now bone-thin and trembling. Clayton's first instinct was to call 911, but his nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and the ranch sat in a cellular dead zone. The closest hospital was 45 minutes by truck, assuming the roads were clear. He made a quick assessment. The woman was breathing. Her pulse was weak but steady, and she showed no obvious signs of trauma. Whatever had brought her to his doorstep, she needed immediate care that he'd have to provide himself. He carried her inside with surprising ease. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds. The guest bedroom downstairs had remained untouched since Sarah left, still decorated with the floral wallpaper and antique furniture she'd selected during their early years of marriage. Clayton laid the stranger on the 4-poster bed and covered her with a quilt his grandmother had sewn decades earlier. As he settled her onto the bed, something fell from the folds of her dress, a small leather journal worn smooth by countless hands. The cover was unmarked, held closed by a thin leather strap. Clayton set it on the nightstand without examination, his immediate concern focused on the woman's welfare. He'd learned basic first aid during his years managing the ranch, knowledge born of necessity when you lived hours from professional medical help. Her breathing was shallow but regular, her skin pale and cold to the touch. Dehydration seemed the most pressing concern, followed by what appeared to be severe malnourishment. He prepared a weak solution of water and salt, managing to get small amounts past her lips using a medicine dropper he kept in the ranch's first aid kit. For 3 days, the woman drifted in and out of consciousness. Clayton maintained a steady routine of providing small amounts of liquid nourishment, water, weak broth, and eventually diluted fruit juice. He'd moved a chair into the guest room, sleeping there in shifts to monitor her condition. During her conscious moments, She would look around with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. But she remained silent. On the fourth morning, Clayton entered the room to find her sitting up, though she remained weak and unsteady. Her eyes followed him as he approached with a cup of warm broth. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the refined accent of someone educated back east. "I'm Margaret Whitfield. Clayton Murdoch, this is my ranch." He offered her the broth, which she accepted with trembling hands. "Ma'am, I need to ask, how did you get here?" "My ranch is 30 miles from the nearest town, and there's no public transportation out this way." Margaret took a careful sip of broth before responding. "I walked from Riverside. Took me the better part of 2 days." Clayton felt his stomach drop. Riverside was indeed 30 miles northeast, but the terrain between the town and his ranch was unforgiving, rolling hills, creek beds, and stretches of open prairie with no shelter or landmarks. For a woman in her condition to make that journey on foot seemed impossible. "Ma'am, that's a hard walk for someone in good health." "In your condition, .. double quotes," he trailed off, not wanting to sound accusatory. "I had my reasons," Margaret replied, her tone suggesting the conversation was closed. She continued sipping the broth, and Clayton noticed her hands had stopped trembling quite as severely. Over the next several days, Margaret's physical condition improved gradually. Clayton prepared simple, nourishing meals, scrambled eggs, toast, mild soups, foods that wouldn't overwhelm her recovering system. She remained polite but distant, answering direct questions with minimal responses and volunteering no information about her circumstances or how she'd ended up collapsed on his porch. It was during this period that Clayton's curiosity about the leather journal grew stronger. It remained on the nightstand where he'd placed it, untouched and unexplained. Margaret never acknowledged its presence, though he occasionally caught her glance in its direction with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, something between longing and dread. On the 7th day, as Margaret sat in the main room near the stone fireplace, wrapped in one of Sarah's old robes, Clayton decided to address the obvious questions that hung between them. "Mrs. Whitfield, I don't mean to pry, but I think I have a right to know what brought you to my ranch. You nearly died on my porch, and I've been caring for you for a week without understanding the first thing about your situation," Margaret said down her cup of tea and looked directly at him for the first time since she'd regained consciousness. Her eyes held a weight that spoke of experiences Clayton couldn't imagine. "You're right, of course. You've shown me incredible kindness, and I've been ungrateful in my silence." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I came here specifically to find you, Mr. Murdoch, or rather, to find your family." Clayton felt the room temperature seem to drop. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your great-grandfather, Silas Murdoch. He founded this ranch in 1889, correct?" "That's right, but I don't understand what that has to do with. My maiden name was Margaret Caldwell. My family had a homestead about 15 miles northeast of here, near what's now Riverside. We lost everything in 1932. The year hit Clayton like a physical blow. 1932 was a date that lived in family legend, the year his great-grandfather had expanded the ranch significantly, purchasing several adjoining properties during the depths of the Great Depression. Family stories portrayed Silas as a shrewd businessman who'd managed to thrive when others failed, securing the ranch's future through careful planning and wise investments. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm not sure what you're suggesting." "But I'm not suggesting anything. Mr. Murdoch, I'm telling you that your great-grandfather stole our land, along with the land of 7 other families in this valley. He didn't buy it through any legitimate transaction. He forged documents, bribed officials, and when that wasn't enough, he used violence and intimidation to drive families from their homes." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Clayton's first impulse was to defend his family's honor, to reject such claims as the ravings of a confused elderly woman. But something in Margaret's tone, the complete absence of hysteria or vindictiveness, made him pause. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. Do you have any proof? Margaret's eyes moved to the leather journal on the distant knitstand. More proof than you might want to see. That evening, after Margaret had retired to the guest room, Clayton found himself staring out the kitchen window at the vast expanse of his ranch. The land rolled away in gentle waves toward the mountains, dotted with cattle and cross-fenced with miles of barbed wire. Every acre represented generations of his family's work, their dreams and sacrifices. The idea that it had been built on theft and violence seemed incomprehensible, yet he couldn't shake the image of Margaret's eyes when she'd spoken about 1932. There had been no madness there, no confusion, just a terrible, weary certainty. He'd grown up hearing stories about the expansion of 1932, but now that he thought about it, the details had always been vague. His great-grandfather had been portrayed as a man who'd somehow prospered during the worst economic disaster in American history, but the mechanics of that prosperity had never been clearly explained. Clayton had assumed it was simply good business, sense combined with careful saving, but Margaret's words forced him to consider other possibilities. Sleep came fitfully that night. Clayton found himself remembering odd details from his childhood. Whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, his great-grandfather's reluctance to discuss certain aspects of the ranch's history, the way older residents of Riverside would sometimes look at the Murdoch name with expressions he'd never understood. The next morning, Margaret appeared stronger than she'd been since her arrival. She'd managed to dress herself in clothes Clayton had retrieved from a donation box at the county church. Simple but clean garments that fit reasonably well. She seemed to have reached some internal decision overnight. "Mr. Murdoch, I owe you an explanation, and you deserve to hear the full truth about what happened in this valley." She gestured toward the guest room. "That diary contains the account of everything your great-grandfather did to my family and others. But before you read it, I want you to understand that I didn't come here seeking revenge or compensation. Those days are long past. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Then why did you come? Because the truth has a weight to it, and I'm too old to carry it alone anymore. My husband died 3 years ago. Our children are grown and scattered across the country. I've spent decades keeping this secret, and I realized I was going to take it to my grave unless I found the courage to share it with someone who needed to know." Clayton poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands less steady than usual. "And you think I need to know? I think you have a right to know. What you do with the knowledge is entirely up to you." Margaret retrieved the leather journal from the knitstand and placed it on the kitchen table between them. In the morning light, Clayton could see that the leather was incredibly worn, the edges soft from decades of handling. The binding was hand-stitched, and the cover bore the faint impression of initials that had been worn nearly smooth. "This belonged to my mother, Eleanor Caldwell. She started writing in it when she was 16 and continued until the day she died." The entries about 1932 begin on page 127. Clayton stared at the journal without touching it. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm not sure I'm ready to read it. When you're ready, Mr. Murdoch. I'll be here." The rest of the morning passed in uncomfortable silence. Clayton went about his usual ranch duties, checking on the cattle, mending a section of fence damaged by the previous week's storm, servicing one of the tractors, but his mind kept returning to the journal sitting on his kitchen table. By afternoon, his curiosity had overcome his reluctance. Margaret was resting in the guest room when Clayton finally opened the diary. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting in fading blue ink, the words of a woman documenting her daily life in careful, precise script. The early entries described the routine concerns of a homesteading family, weather, crops, livestock, and the small celebrations and tragedies that marked frontier life. Page 127 began with an entry dated March 15, 1932. "The Murdoch man came. Buy again today with his offer. Papa told him the same thing he's told him 6 times before. We're not selling. The land has been in our family for 40 years, and we intend to keep it that way. There was something different about Silas Murdoch this time, though. Something cold in his eyes when Papa refused him. He said Papa might want to reconsider, that times were going to get harder before they got better. The way he said it didn't sound like a prediction. It sounded like a promise. Clayton's hands trembled as he turned the page. The handwriting continued in the same careful script, but the tone had shifted from routine observation to something darker. March 22, 1932. 3 of our cattle were found dead this morning, shot through the head and left to rot in the south pasture. Papa is beside himself with rage and grief. Those animals represented months of careful breeding and feeding, money we desperately needed with beef prices so low. Sheriff Morrison came out to investigate, but he barely looked at the carcasses. Before declaring, it must have been rustlers passing through. Papa pointed out that rustlers would have taken the cattle, not slaughtered them wastefully, but Morrison just shrugged and said these were hard times for everyone. I noticed Morrison's deputy stayed in the truck the entire time. And when they drove away, they headed toward the Murdoch Ranch instead of back to town. Clayton felt his coffee grow cold as he read. His great-grandfather's name kept appearing in entries that painted an increasingly sinister picture. The diary described a systematic campaign of harassment against the Caldwell family and their neighbors. Livestock poisoned, wells contaminated, barns set ablaze in the dead of night. Each incident was followed by another visit from Silas Murdoch. Another offer to purchase their land at far below market value. April 3, 1932. Papa met with the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, and the other families facing the same troubles. Everyone has lost livestock or had property damaged. The Kowalski boy swears he saw men on horseback riding away from their barn the night before it burned, and one of them was definitely riding that spotted horse Silas Murdoch is so proud of. But when Papa suggested they all go to the sheriff together, Mrs. Henderson broke down crying. She said her husband tried to file a complaint last week, and Morrison told him that making false accusations against prominent citizens could land him in jail. We're trapped. The banks won't extend our loans without collateral, but our collateral keeps mysteriously dying or disappearing. Murdoch knows exactly what he's doing. The entries grew more desperate as spring turned to summer. Eleanor Caldwell documented a family under siege, watching their livelihood systematically destroyed while law enforcement turned a blind eye. Clayton found himself reading faster, drawn into the narrative despite his growing horror at what it revealed about his family's legacy. June 14, 1932. Papa received a letter today that nearly broke his spirit completely. The bank is foreclosing on our mortgage, effective immediately. They claim we've defaulted on payments, but Papa showed me the receipts. We've never missed a single payment, even when it meant going without proper meals. When Papa rode to town to contest the foreclosure, he discovered that our payment records had mysteriously disappeared from the bank's files. The bank president, Mr. Hartwell, was apologetic but firm. He said the bank had been purchased by new investors who were demanding immediate payment of all outstanding debts. When Papa asked who these new investors were, Hartwell couldn't meet his eyes. I don't need to ask. We all know who has that kind of money in this valley. Clayton pushed back from the table, his mind reeling. The implications were staggering, not just theft, but a coordinated conspiracy involving banks, law enforcement, and local officials. His great-grandfather hadn't simply taken advantage of desperate times. He'd created those desperate times. Through deliberate sabotage and corruption. Margaret appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but steadily. She studied his expression and nodded knowingly. "You're starting to understand the scope of it," she said quietly. "This can't be true. My family built this ranch through honest work. We've been pillars of the community for generations. Built it on what foundation, though?" Margaret settled into the chair across from him, Mr. Murdoch, I understand this is difficult to accept. I've had 70 years to come to terms with what happened to my family. You've had 7 minutes. Clayton looked down at the diary, still open to Eleanor Caldwell's increasingly frantic entries. Even if this is all true, what does it have to do with now? Everyone involved has been dead for decades. Keep reading. You'll understand soon enough. The summer entries detailed the final collapse of the Caldwell homestead. Foreclosure proceedings moved with suspicious speed, pushed through a court system that seemed eager to expedite the transfer of property titles. Eleanor described her father's descent into despair as he watched 4 decades of family history dissolve in a matter of weeks. July 28, 1932. The eviction notice arrived today. We have 10 days to vacate the premises. Papa hasn't spoken a word since the sheriff delivered the papers. He just sits on the porch, staring out at the fields his father cleared by hand 40 years ago. Mama is packing what little we can carry, but where are we supposed to go? The Kowalskis left for California. Last week, the Hendersons moved in with relatives in Denver. One by one, our neighbors are disappearing, and the Murdoch ranch keeps growing larger. I saw Silas Murdoch riding through our south pasture yesterday, surveying his new acquisition. He had the decency to look away when he noticed me watching from the kitchen window, but there was no shame in his posture. This was always his plan. The final entries from the Caldwell homestead were heartbreaking in their simple dignity. Eleanor wrote about her family's last night in the house her grandfather had built, about her father's tears as he took down the family photographs, about her mother's silent grief as she abandoned the garden she'd tended for 25 years. August 8, 1932. We left this morning before dawn. Papa couldn't bear to see Murdoch's men take possession of the house. We loaded what we could into the wagon and drove toward town, not looking back. Mama finally broke her silence as we crested the hill that would take the homestead out of view forever. She said, "The land remembers, Eleanor. It always remembers." I don't know what she meant then, but I think I'm beginning to understand. Some wounds don't heal with time. They just get passed down. Clayton closed the diary and sat in silence for several minutes. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the table. Outside, his cattle grazed peacefully on grass that had been watered by 3 generations of honest labor, or so he'd always believed. "What happened to your family after they lost the farm?" he asked finally. Margaret's expression grew distant. "We moved to Riverside, rented a small house near the railroad tracks. Papa tried to find work, but word had gotten around that he was a troublemaker. Mama took in washing and mending to help make ends meet. I was 19, old enough to work as a clerk in the general store. And your father never recovered from losing the land. He'd been born on that homestead, expected to die there, and pass it on to his children. When that was taken from him, something essential broke inside. He lasted 2 more years before his heart gave out. Mama always said he died of grief." Clayton studied Margaret's weathered features, seeing past the elderly woman to the teenage girl who'd watched her family's world collapse. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, but I still don't understand why you came here now, after all these years." Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand on the diary. "Because there's more to the story. The entries you just read were written while my mother was still a young woman, still believing that justice would eventually prevail. But she kept writing in this diary for 40 more years, and she discovered things about Silas Murdoch that would shock even you." Before Clayton could respond, Margaret continued, "Your great-grandfather didn't stop stealing our land. That was just the beginning. Over the next decade, he expanded his operations beyond simple property theft. He ran a network that stretched from Montana to Wyoming, involving cattle rustling, illegal timber harvesting, and worse. Much worse. What do you mean worse? People who opposed him had a tendency to disappear. Not just leave town, disappear entirely. Bodies were never found. Families never got closure. The diary contains details about at least 6 such disappearances, including witnesses who saw Murdoch's men involved. Clayton felt the world shift beneath him. Property theft was one thing, horrible but perhaps understandable in the context of desperate economic times. But murder? You're talking about serial killing. I'm talking about a criminal enterprise that operated with complete impunity because Silas Murdoch owned every official who mattered in 3 counties. Sheriff Morrison was on his payroll, along with judges, bank presidents, and land office clerks. Anyone who threatened to expose the operation simply vanished. The kitchen fell silent except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. Clayton tried to process what he was hearing, but it seemed too enormous to grasp. His entire understanding of his family's history was crumbling with each revelation. Mrs. Whitfield, these are incredibly serious accusations. Even if they're true, everyone involved has been dead for generations. What's the point of dredging this up now? Margaret stood slowly and walked to the window overlooking the ranch yard. Because it didn't end with Silas. Mr. Murdoch, the network he built, survived his death in 1943. It adapted, evolved, became more sophisticated, and it's still operating. Clayton's blood went cold. What are you talking about? My husband spent 30 years as a private investigator. After we married in 1955, I told him about what had happened to my family. He became obsessed with uncovering the full scope of Murdoch's criminal network. What he discovered was that the organization had simply passed to new leadership after Silas died. New leadership? Your grandfather, Thomas Murdoch. And after him, your father, Robert. The methods became more subtle, more legally defensible. But the essential business remained the same, acquiring property and resources through fraud, intimidation, and when necessary, violence. Clayton shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. Now you've gone too far. My father was a respected member of this community. He served on the school board, donated to charity, never had so much as a speeding ticket. You're talking about some kind of criminal dynasty, and that's just impossible. Margaret turned from the window, her expression compassionate but unwavering. Mr. Murdoch, I understand how difficult this must be to hear, but the evidence is overwhelming. My husband documented everything. Shell companies used to hide property transactions, bribes paid to local officials, intimidation campaigns against families who refused to sell their land. The Murdoch Ranch grew from 3,000 acres to over 15,000 acres during your father's lifetime. Do you really believe all those acquisitions were legitimate? Clayton's mind raced through his memories of his father. Robert Murdoch had indeed been a pillar of the community, but Clayton now recalled aspects of his personality that had always troubled him. The cold calculation behind his business decisions, his utter lack of sentimentality when it came to weak neighbors who couldn't maintain their properties, his contempt for what he called bleeding hearts who showed too much sympathy for struggling families. Even if that's true, it has nothing to do with me. I inherited the ranch when my father died 15 years ago, but I've never expanded it. I've never pressured anyone to sell their land, haven't you? Margaret's question was gentle but pointed. What about the Morrison family? They owned the 800 acres directly north of your property line. Beautiful grazing land with good water access. They lost it to foreclosure about 7 years ago, and somehow those parcels ended up being sold to a subsidiary company that turned out to be owned by a holding company that traced back to your ranch corporation. Clayton felt the floor drop away beneath him. The Morrison foreclosure had been handled entirely by his lawyer and accountant. He'd been told it was a straightforward business acquisition, an opportunity to expand the ranch's grazing capacity at a fair market price. He'd signed the papers without asking detailed questions about how the land had become available. I didn't know, he whispered. I believe you, Margaret said. But that's how the system works, isn't it? Each generation becomes a little more removed from the actual dirty work. Your great-grandfather personally intimidated families and burned their barns. Your grandfather used corrupt officials and fraudulent paperwork. Your father employed lawyers and shell companies, and you just sign documents prepared by others, trusting that everything is legal and proper. Clayton sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Are you saying I'm part of some criminal conspiracy? I'm saying you're the inheritor of one, whether you know it or not. The question now is what you're going to do about it. Margaret returned to her seat and opened the diary to a section near the back. The final entries in here were written by my mother in the 1970s, shortly before she died. By then, my husband's investigation had uncovered the full scope of what your family had built. She wanted to leave a record for future generations, both yours and mine. She turned the diary so Clayton could see the page. The handwriting was shakier now, the work of an elderly woman with failing eyesight. But the words were clear. June 10, 1975, Eleanor Margaret showed me the evidence her husband has gathered about the Murdoch family operations. The scope of it is beyond anything I imagined in my darkest moments back in 1932. Silas wasn't just a greedy man who stole our farm. He was the architect of a criminal empire that destroyed dozens of families and corrupted entire regions, legal and political systems. But what breaks my heart is the realization that the young men inheriting this legacy may not even understand what they've inherited. Robert Murdoch seems like a decent enough person in his public dealings. His son Clayton appears to be growing up with normal values and genuine kindness. How do you hold someone accountable for crimes they didn't know they were committing? I pray that someday someone will find the courage to break this cycle. The land remembers what was done to it, but perhaps it can also remember what was done to heal it. That Clayton stared at his own name, written in Eleanor Caldwell's careful script. The woman had been thinking about him while he was still a child, wondering about his character and his future choices. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. She knew about me, he said quietly. She hoped for you, Margaret corrected. She believed that eventually, someone in your family would choose to break the pattern. That's why I'm here, Mr. Murdoch. Not for revenge, not for compensation, but to give you the choice she prayed you would have, the choice to know the truth and decide what to do with it. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Clayton stared at the diary entry containing his name, written by a woman who had died before he'd graduated high school. The afternoon light was fading, casting the kitchen in amber shadows that seemed to deepen the weight of everything he'd learned. Mrs. Whitfield, he said finally, his voice hoarse. You mentioned your husband was a private investigator. What exactly did he find? Margaret reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a small brass key. He found enough evidence to fill 3 filing cabinets. Bank records, property deeds, correspondence between your family and various officials, witness statements from people who were afraid to speak up while they were alive, but left sealed testimonies to be opened after their deaths. Where is all this evidence now? Locked in a storage unit in Billings, Unit 247 at Secure Store on Industrial Avenue. She placed the key on the table between them. My husband made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find a way to get this information to someone who could use it responsibly, someone with the power to make things right. Clayton picked up the key, surprised by how warm it felt from Margaret's pocket. Such a small object to hold such enormous implications. What kind of things right? Everyone who was directly harmed is dead. Their children have moved on, built new lives elsewhere. Have they? Margaret's question carried an edge he hadn't heard before. Mr. Murdoch, your family's operation didn't stop in the 1970s. It adapted to modern times. The methods became more sophisticated, but the essential business model remained the same. Identify vulnerable properties. Create financial pressure through various means. acquire the land at below market prices, and consolidate power. Clayton felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? I'm saying that in the past 15 years since your father's death, at least 12 families in this county have lost their properties under suspicious circumstances. The Morrisons were just one example. Each case followed a similar pattern: unexpected financial difficulties, pressure from creditors, foreclosure proceedings that moved unusually quickly, and eventual sale to companies that trace back to your ranch's business interests. That's impossible. I would have known, would you? Margaret interrupted. Tell me, Mr. Murdoch, who handles your legal affairs? Pemberton, Hayes and Associates in Billings. They've represented my family for 3 generations. And your financial planning? First Mountain Trust Company. Again, a long-standing relationship. Margaret nodded grimly. Both firms were identified in my husband's investigation as key components of the Murdoch network. They didn't just provide services to your family, they actively facilitated the acquisition strategy. When you sign documents prepared by Pemberton Hayes, you're not just conducting routine business. You're authorizing the continuation of a system that's been destroying families for nearly a century. Clayton's hands began to shake. He thought about all the papers he'd signed over the years, trusting his lawyers and financial advisors to handle the complex details of ranch management. Property acquisitions, investment strategies, tax planning. He'd been proud of his hands-off approach, believing it showed wisdom to delegate such matters to experts. The Morrison property, he said slowly. You said I acquired it through foreclosure. I was told it was a routine purchase. Your lawyers arranged for Morrison Family Farm to receive a loan from a shell company at below market interest rates. The loan terms included a balloon payment after 5 years, a payment the Morrisons were never going to be able to make. When they defaulted, the property went into foreclosure, and another shell company, this one controlled by First Mountain Trust, purchased it at auction. 3 months later, that company sold the land to Broken Arrow Ranch for exactly what they'd paid at auction. Clayton felt sick. So I got the land at foreclosure prices, but it was designed to look like a legitimate business transaction. Exactly. And the Morrisons? They lost their family homestead and received just enough money from the foreclosure sale to cover their original loan balance. 40 years of equity in that land, wiped out through financial manipulation. The implications cascaded through Clayton's mind. How many other acquisitions had followed similar patterns? How many families had been quietly destroyed while he remained obliviously grateful for his ranch's continued prosperity? Mrs. Whitfield, if what you're telling me is true, then I'm not just the inheritor of a criminal legacy. I'm an active participant in ongoing crimes. That's one way to look at it. Another way is that you're a victim too, a victim of a system designed to keep you ignorant of its true nature while using your name and resources to perpetuate itself. Clayton stood abruptly and walked to the window. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. His cattle were moving slowly toward the barn for evening feeding, following routines established over generations. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, but the world had fundamentally changed. What do you want from me? He asked without turning around. I want you to break the cycle. How? Even if I could somehow return all the land that was stolen. Most of the original families are scattered across the country, and there's probably no legal way to prove fraud in transactions that happened decades ago. Margaret joined him at the window. Despite her frail appearance, her presence seemed to radiate a quiet strength. My husband spent the last years of his life developing a plan for exactly that situation. He called it the Restoration Project. What kind of plan? A comprehensive program to identify all the families who lost property to your family's operations, track down their descendants, and provide meaningful restitution. Not just money, actual restoration of what was taken. Clayton turned to face her. That would require giving away most of the ranch. Not all of it. The original Broken Arrow Ranch consisted of 640 acres, 1 square mile purchased legitimately by your great-grandfather before he turned to criminal methods. That land would remain yours. But the additional 14,000 acres acquired through fraud and intimidation over the past 90 years, those parcels could be returned to their rightful owners or their descendants. The scope of what she was suggesting was breathtaking. Clayton tried to imagine the Broken Arrow Ranch reduced to its original size, tried to picture his life without the vast grazing lands and diversified operations that had made him one of the wealthiest ranchers in the region. Mrs. Whitfield, what you're describing would essentially destroy everything my family has built. Or it would restore what your family destroyed, she replied gently. The question is whether you see those as the same thing. They stood in silence. As darkness settled over the ranch, Clayton could see lights beginning to flicker on in the distant homes of his hired hands, families who depended on the ranch for their livelihoods. The weight of responsibility felt crushing. Even if I wanted to do something like this, the legal complications would be enormous. Property rights, statute of limitations, current owners who purchased land in good faith. It would take years to sort out. My husband anticipated those challenges. The evidence he collected includes detailed chain of title documentation for every questionable acquisition, proof of the fraudulent methods used, and contact information for hundreds of descendants of the original property owners. More importantly, he identified legal strategies that could expedite the restoration process. Margaret returned to the table and opened the diary to a section near the back. The final entries contain his preliminary plan. He spent years consulting with attorneys who specialized in historical land fraud cases. It's complex, but it's feasible. Clayton remained at the window, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision facing him. Why didn't your husband pursue this himself? If he had all this evidence, why didn't he go to the authorities? He tried multiple times. But the corruption your great-grandfather established has deep roots. Key officials in the county are still connected to the network, either through direct payoffs or simply through generations of inherited relationships. When my husband approached the state attorney general's office in 1998, his evidence mysteriously disappeared from their files within a week. Someone was watching him. Someone was watching all of us. My husband received 3 clear warnings to drop his investigation. The first was a break-in at our home where only his research files were stolen. The second was a car accident that the investigating officer ruled mechanical failure, despite my husband's insistence that the brake lines had been cut. The third was a phone call 2 days before he died, informing him that any attempt to publicize his findings would result in harm to me. Clayton felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. You think he was murdered? I think he died of a heart attack brought on by years of stress and fear. But whether that heart attack was natural or induced by someone who wanted him silenced, I'll never know for certain. The kitchen fell silent except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. Clayton realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just his own future, but the future of countless families whose histories had been shaped by his family's crimes. Mrs. Whitfield, you said you walked 30 miles to reach this ranch. That's an incredible journey for someone in your condition. What made you so desperate to get here? Margaret's expression grew distant. 3 months ago, I received a phone call from a young woman named Sarah Chun. Her grandmother was Lisa Kowalski, one of the families forced off their land in 1932. Sarah had been researching her family history and discovered references to the Kowalski homestead in some old documents. What kind of references? Property deeds that showed the Kowalski land had never been legally transferred to your great-grandfather. The foreclosure documents were forged, but the original deeds were still on file in the state archives. Sarah was planning to hire a lawyer and file a claim to recover her family's property. Clayton's stomach dropped. Was planning? Sarah Chun died in a single-car accident 2 weeks after she contacted me. Her car went off a mountain road during clear weather, on a stretch she'd driven hundreds of times. The investigating officer ruled it driver error, despite evidence that someone had tampered with her steering mechanism. The implication hung in the air like a physical weight. Clayton turned from the window, his face pale. "You're saying she was murdered to prevent her from filing a legal claim?" "I'm saying that someone is still actively protecting the Murdoch family's interests, using whatever methods necessary. Sarah's death wasn't investigated as a homicide because the local sheriff's department has been compromised for 3 generations. But her grandmother's property deeds are still in the state archives, and other descendants of dispossessed families are beginning to ask questions." Clayton sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the realization that the criminal network hadn't just survived. It was still operating, still destroying lives to protect secrets that went back nearly a century. How many other families are at risk? Margaret opened the diary to a page filled with names and dates. "My husband identified 47 families whose descendants might have legitimate claims to property, currently controlled by the Murdoch network. If even half of them decide to pursue legal action, the entire system could unravel. Unless they're stopped." "Unless they're stopped," Margaret confirmed. "Which is why I had to reach you before someone decided I was also a threat. At my age, another accident wouldn't surprise anyone." Clayton studied Margaret's weathered face, seeing past the frail elderly woman to the courage that had driven her to make an impossible journey. "You risked your life to come here. I risked my life to give you the chance to choose differently than your ancestors. The cycle can end with you, Mr. Murdoch, but only if you have the courage to break it." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of rain from the distant mountains. Clayton thought about Sarah Chen, a young woman who died simply for asking questions about her family's history. He thought about the Morrison family, losing their homestead through financial manipulation they probably never understood. He thought about 47 other families whose descendants might be marked for similar fates. "The storage unit key," he said finally. "What exactly is in those files?" "Everything. Bank records showing illegal transfers, correspondence proving bribery and corruption, witness statements from people who saw crimes committed, property deeds that prove fraud, and most importantly, a complete plan for restoration that could return stolen land to its rightful owners while providing legal protection for everyone involved." Clayton picked up the brass key, feeling its weight in his palm. Such a small object to hold such enormous power, the power to destroy his family's legacy or to transform it into something honorable. "If I open that storage unit, there's no going back, is there?" "No," Margaret said softly. "Once you know the full truth, you'll have to decide whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. There's no middle ground." The storm that had been threatening all day finally arrived, sending the first drops of rain against the kitchen windows. Clayton closed his eyes and listened to the sound, thinking about all the storms his family had weathered over the past century. Some had been natural disasters that tested their resilience. Others had been of their own making, destroying innocent people while enriching themselves. When he opened his eyes, Margaret was watching him with an expression of quiet hope. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice steady for the first time since morning. "Tomorrow we're driving to Billings." The drive to Billings took place under heavy gray clouds that seemed to mirror Clayton's mood. Margaret sat quietly in the passenger seat of his truck, the diary clutched in her lap like a shield against the unknown. Neither of them spoke much during the 3-hour journey, both lost in thoughts about what they might discover in the storage unit. Secure Store sat on the industrial outskirts of Billings, a sprawling complex of corrugated metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Unit 247 was located in the back section, away from the main office and foot traffic. As Clayton pulled his truck up to the loading dock, he noticed that most of the nearby units appeared abandoned. their roll-up doors secured with heavy padlocks and thick layers of dust. Margaret's hand shook as she handed him the brass key. "My husband paid the rental fees 20 years in advance," she said quietly. "He wanted to ensure the evidence would survive even if something happened to us." The lock turned easily despite its age, and the metal door rolled up with a screech that seemed to echo through the empty complex. Clayton stepped inside and fumbled for a light switch, finally locating a pull chain that illuminated a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. What he saw took his breath away. The storage unit was organized like a professional archive. 3 massive filing cabinets lined the back wall, each drawer meticulously labeled with dates, property descriptions, and family names. A large table occupied the center of the space, covered with maps, photographs, and legal documents. Bankers' boxes were stacked floor to ceiling along one wall, each container numbered and cataloged. Margaret followed him inside, moving slowly but with obvious familiarity. "Thomas spent 15 years assembling all of this," she said, running her hand along one of the filing cabinets. "He called it his life's work." Clayton approached the table, where a detailed map of the region was spread out and covered with colored pins. Red pins marked properties acquired by the Murdoch family between 1930 and 1950. Blue pins indicated acquisitions from 1950 to 1980. Yellow pins showed properties obtained since 1980. The pattern was overwhelming, a spider web of acquisitions that had gradually consumed nearly every family farm and ranch in a 50-mile radius. "Dear God," Clayton whispered. "I had no idea the scope was this large." Margaret opened the nearest filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder marked Morrison Family, 2018. Inside were copies of loan documents, correspondence between lawyers, and a detailed timeline showing how the Morrison farm had been systematically targeted for acquisition. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a letter dated 6 months before the Morrisons received their fateful loan offer. The letter was from Pemberton, Hayes and Associates to First Mountain Trust Company, outlining a strategy to create financial pressure on the Morrison property through a series of seemingly unrelated actions. Clayton read the letter with growing horror. The plan included arranging for the Morrisons' primary bank to suddenly tighten their existing credit terms, causing problems with their livestock feed suppliers. Simultaneously, a shell company would begin purchasing grain futures to artificially inflate feed costs in the region. When the Morrisons found themselves facing a cash flow crisis, the shell company controlled by First Mountain Trust would appear as a helpful lender, offering what seemed like a generous loan with reasonable initial terms. This is beyond criminal," Clayton said, his voice barely audible. "This is systematic economic warfare against innocent families." Margaret nodded grimly. "And it's been happening continuously for 90 years. Your family's empire wasn't built through hard work and good fortune. It was built through the deliberate destruction of everyone around you." Clayton moved. Another filing cabinet, this one labeled Historical Acquisitions 1930 to 1960. The first folder he opened contained the complete file on his own family's original homestead. What he found challenged everything he'd been told about his great-grandfather's legitimate purchase of the initial 640 acres. According to the documents, Silas Murdoch had never actually purchased the original homestead land. Instead, he'd forged a deed transfer after murdering the property's actual owner, a Swedish immigrant named Eric Lindquist, who'd filed a legitimate homestead claim in 1887. Lindquist's body had been found in a remote canyon in 1889, but the death was ruled accidental, despite evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. "Margaret," Clayton called, his voice hollow. Even the original ranch was stolen. She joined him at the filing cabinet, reading over his shoulder. Thomas discovered that in 1994. It was one of the hardest pieces of evidence for him to uncover, because the murder was covered up so thoroughly. Clayton sank into a chair that had been placed near the table. The magnitude of his family's crimes was beyond anything he'd imagined. Not just theft, not just fraud, but murder spanning nearly a century. Every acre of land he'd considered his birthright had been acquired through violence and corruption. The Lindquist family, he said slowly. What happened to them? Margaret opened another folder. Eric had a wife and 2 young children in Sweden. They were supposed to join him in America once he'd established the homestead. When news of his death reached them, they assumed it was one of the many tragedies that befell immigrants in the frontier. They never knew he'd been murdered for his land. Are there any descendants? Thomas tracked them down in the 1990s. There are over 40 Lindquist descendants living in Minnesota and Wisconsin, most of them unaware that their ancestor ever owned property in Montana. Clayton stared at the folder containing information about people who had a legitimate claim to the very ground beneath his family's ranch house. The irony was almost unbearable. He'd spent his entire life working land that had never rightfully belonged to his family. Mrs. Whitfield, how many murders are documented in these files? Margaret's expression grew even more somber. 17 that can be proven through physical evidence and witness testimony. Probably twice that number if you include deaths that were made to look like accidents or natural causes. Clayton felt bile rise in his throat. 17 people murdered. For land acquisition, 17 people that we know of. The pattern continued through your grandfather's era, though the methods became more sophisticated. Your father's generation preferred financial manipulation and legal intimidation, but there were still occasional accidents when other methods failed. She led him to a wall covered with photographs, dozens of family portraits spanning 9 decades. These were the faces of the victims, the families who'd been destroyed to build the Murdoch empire. Clayton found himself staring at a photograph of a young couple with 3 small children, all dressed in their Sunday best and smiling at the camera. The Henderson family, Margaret explained. They refused to sell their property in 1934. Their house burned down 2 weeks later with the entire family inside. The fire was ruled accidental, but witnesses reported seeing men on horseback fleeing the scene. Clayton turned away from the photographs, unable to look at the faces of people his family had murdered. How did my father live with himself, knowing all this? Perhaps he convinced himself that he was simply continuing a family tradition. Perhaps he told himself that the ends justified the means. Or perhaps he was simply a sociopath who felt no guilt about destroying other people's lives. The storage unit fell silent except for the hum of traffic on the distant highway. Clayton walked slowly around the space, taking in the overwhelming evidence of his family's crimes. Every document, every photograph, every carefully organized file represented lives destroyed, families scattered, dreams crushed. The restoration project your husband developed, he said finally. How would it actually work? Margaret moved to a section of the filing cabinets he hadn't yet explored and withdrew a thick binder marked Implementation Strategy. Inside were detailed legal documents, financial projections, and step-by-step procedures for returning stolen property to its rightful owners. The first phase would involve contacting all the descendant families and explaining what happened to their ancestors, she said, flipping through the pages. Thomas identified legal representatives in several states who specialize in historical land fraud cases. They've agreed to handle the cases pro bono if solid evidence can be provided. What about current property owners who purchased land in good faith? The plan includes a compensation fund that would reimburse anyone who loses property they legitimately purchased. The fund would be established using assets from the Murdoch Ranch and the various shell companies that facilitated the fraud. Clayton studied the financial projections, which showed that implementing the full restoration project would require liquidating virtually all of his family's holdings. The ranch house, the original 640 acres, and a modest compensation fund would be all that remained of the once mighty Murdoch empire. "This would essentially make me a poor man," he said quietly. "It would make you an honest man," Margaret replied. "For the first time in 4 generations." Clayton continued reading through the implementation strategy, impressed despite himself by the thoroughness of the planning. Thomas Whitfield had anticipated every legal obstacle, every political challenge, every emotional difficulty that might arise during the restoration process. The plan wasn't just idealistic, it was practical and achievable. "There's something else," Margaret said, opening another section of the binder. Thomas developed contingency plans for what might happen if the current network tried to stop the restoration. The contingency section made for sobering reading. Thomas had documented the ongoing criminal operations in detail, identifying current participants and their methods of intimidation. He'd also outlined strategies for protecting participant families from retaliation, including safe house arrangements and federal witness protection protocols. Federal witness protection? Clayton looked up from the documents. "You're talking about treating this like organized crime." "Because that's exactly what it is. The Murdoch Network meets every legal definition of a criminal enterprise. It has a hierarchical structure, engages in ongoing illegal activities, uses violence and intimidation to protect its interests, and corrupts public officials to avoid prosecution." Clayton felt the weight of realization settling over him like a physical burden. His family wasn't just guilty of historical crimes, they were the hereditary leaders of an active, criminal organization that continued to operate in his name. "Margaret, if I move forward with this restoration plan, I won't just be giving away my family's wealth. I'll be declaring war on a criminal network that's proven willing to kill to protect itself." "Yes," she said simply. "That's exactly what you'll be doing." They stood in silence among the evidence of 90 years of crimes. Clayton thought about Sarah Chun, murdered for asking questions about her family's stolen land. He thought about the Morrison family, destroyed through financial manipulation while he remained blissfully ignorant. He thought about the 17 documented murders and the countless other lives ruined to build his family's fortune. "There's one more thing you need to see," Margaret said, leading him to a final filing cabinet. This one was labeled "Current Threats and Active Surveillance." The files inside were more recent, some dated within the past 6 months. They contained photographs of people Clayton didn't recognize, surveillance reports, and intercepted communications. As he read through them, a chilling picture emerged of a network that was very much alive and actively monitoring potential threats to its continued operation. "These surveillance reports," Clayton said, his blood running cold. "They're watching the families of the victims. Not just watching. Several descendants who've begun researching their family histories have received anonymous warnings to stop their investigations. 2 others have suffered suspicious accidents similar to what happened to Sarah Chun." Clayton found a folder with his own name on it. Inside were photographs of his ranch, his truck, even pictures of them taken from a distance while he was working with his cattle. The most recent photo was dated just 1 week ago. "They've been watching me too." Thomas always suspected that the network maintained surveillance on the Murdoch family to ensure continued cooperation. They needed to know if you ever became a threat to their operations. The implications were terrifying. Clayton realized that his every move had probably been monitored for years, his communications intercepted, his activities reported to people who saw him as both an asset and a potential liability. "Margaret, by coming here today, by opening this storage unit, we've probably triggered some kind of alert." She nodded grimly. "Almost certainly, which means we don't have much time." Clayton looked around the storage unit one final time, taking in the overwhelming evidence of his family's crimes and the detailed plan for making amends. The choice before him was stark and unforgiving: continue living as the unknowing figurehead of a criminal empire, or risk everything to break a cycle of violence that had persisted for nearly a century. How long would it take to implement the first phase of the restoration plan? Margaret consulted the timeline in the implementation binder. If we move quickly, we could begin contacting descendant families within 2 weeks. The legal filings could be submitted simultaneously in multiple jurisdictions to prevent any single court from blocking the process. And how long before the network realizes what we're doing and tries to stop us? Based on their historical response patterns, we have perhaps a month before they resorted to violence. But there are ways to protect ourselves if we move strategically. Clayton closed the binder and looked directly at Margaret. Mrs. Whitfield, if we do this, there's a very good chance we'll both end up dead. Mr. Murdoch, if we don't do this, the killing will never stop. More families will be destroyed, more innocent people will die, and your family's legacy will remain built on blood and theft for another generation. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. The storage unit around them contained evidence of 90 years of systematic evil, and he was the only person positioned to stop it from continuing into the future. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was committing to. "Let's break this thing apart." The first sign of trouble came as they were loading the most crucial documents into Clayton's truck. Margaret had suggested they move the evidence to a safer location before beginning the restoration process, and Clayton agreed that his ranch was too exposed. As he carried a box of files toward the vehicle, he noticed a black SUV parked at the entrance to the storage facility, its tinted windows making it impossible to see the occupants. "Margaret," he said quietly, setting down the box and walking back to the storage unit, "we may have company." She looked toward the entrance and immediately tensed. That vehicle wasn't there when we arrived. Clayton tried to appear casual as he continued loading boxes, but his mind raced through their limited options. The storage facility had only one entrance, and the black SUV was positioned to block any attempt at escape. If the occupants were hostile, he and Margaret were trapped in a remote industrial area with no witnesses and no help. "Keep loading," he murmured to Margaret. "Act like we don't notice them." As they worked, Clayton's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The number was blocked, but the message was chillingly direct. "Step away from the storage unit and return to your truck. Drive home immediately. Forget what you've seen today." Clayton showed the message to Margaret, whose face went pale. "They're monitoring our phones," she whispered. "Thomas always suspected they had that capability, which means they probably know exactly what we found here." Clayton glanced again at the black SUV, which remained motionless at the facility entrance. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need you to get in the truck and lock the doors. If shooting starts, drive straight through that fence behind us and don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You're the only person besides me who knows about this evidence. If something happens to me, you're the only one who can carry out the restoration plan." Before Margaret could protest further, Clayton's phone rang. The caller ID showed only unknown, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Murdoch." The voice was calm, professional, and entirely without emotion. "My name is David Kellerman. I represent certain business interests that have been associated with your family for many decades." "What do you want, Mr. Kellerman?" "I want to discuss your recent visit to Secure Store, Facility Unit 247. I believe you may have encountered some materials that could be misleading or taken out of context." Clayton felt his blood run cold. Not only were they being watched, but the surveillance was sophisticated enough to know exactly which storage unit they'd accessed. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "Mr. Murdoch, let's not waste time with denials. My colleagues and I are well aware of Thomas Whitfield's obsessive investigation into your family's business affairs. We're also aware that Mrs. Whitfield has recently made contact with you. What concerns us is that you might act on incomplete or biased information." "What kind of action are you concerned about?" "The kind that could damage long-standing business relationships and disrupt economic stability in the region. The kind that could result in unfortunate consequences for you and Mrs. Whitfield." The threat was delivered in the same calm professional tone, making it even more chilling. Clayton looked at Margaret, who was listening to his side of the conversation, with obvious fear. "Mr. Kellerman, I think this conversation is over." "Actually, Mr. Murdoch, this conversation is just beginning. Please remain on the line while my associates join you at the storage facility." Clayton saw the doors of the black SUV open, and 3 men in dark suits began walking toward them. They moved with the practiced coordination of people accustomed to violence, their hands positioned near concealed weapons. "Margaret, get in the truck now," Clayton said, ending the call and grabbing the most important box of files. But before either of them could move, one of the men called out, "Mr. Murdoch, Mrs. Whitfield, please step away from the vehicle and storage unit. We need to have a conversation." Clayton positioned himself between Margaret and the approaching men. "This is private property." "You have no right." "We have every right," the lead man interrupted, producing a badge that identified him as a federal marshal. "We're conducting an investigation into potential tax evasion and money laundering activities associated with the Broken Arrow Ranch." The badge looked authentic, but Clayton's experience with his family's legitimate legal issues told him something was wrong. Federal marshals didn't typically conduct financial investigations, and they certainly didn't operate with this level of secrecy and intimidation. "I'd like to see a warrant," Clayton said. "The warrant is being processed. In the meantime, we need to secure any potential evidence that might be removed from the scene." One of the other men had positioned himself near Margaret, close enough to grab her if she tried to run. The third man was examining the boxes they'd loaded into Clayton's truck, clearly familiar with the contents. "Mr. Murdoch," the lead man continued, "we understand that you've recently come into possession of materials related to historical property transactions. These materials are part of an ongoing federal investigation, and removing them from this location could constitute obstruction of justice." Clayton realized they were caught in a carefully orchestrated trap. The network had been monitoring the storage unit, probably for years, waiting for someone to access Thomas Whitfield's evidence. Now they were using federal authority, real or fabricated, to seize the materials and silence the witnesses. "What federal investigation?" Clayton demanded. "I want to speak to your supervisor." "I'm afraid that's not possible at this time." The man gestured to his associates, who began removing boxes from Clayton's truck. "Please step aside and allow us to secure the evidence." Margaret suddenly spoke up, her voice stronger than Clayton had heard since her arrival at his ranch. "These men aren't federal marshals." The lead man turned toward her with obvious irritation. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to remain silent. Thomas always said that if federal authorities ever became involved in investigating the Murdoch network, it would mean the network had been compromised. He said they would never allow genuine federal involvement." Clayton understood immediately. If these men were real federal agents, it would mean the network's protection within law enforcement had failed. The fact that they were here at all suggested they were part of the cover-up, not legitimate investigators. "You're right," Clayton said, looking directly at the lead man. "Real federal marshals would have backup, proper documentation, and they'd be coordinating with local law enforcement. You're here to steal the evidence and probably kill us." The pretense dropped instantly. The lead man's professional demeanor disappeared, replaced by cold calculation. "Mr. Murdoch, you've made this much more difficult than it needed to be. We offered you the opportunity to walk away from this situation. Now we'll have to resolve it permanently." The man near Margaret grabbed her arm, but she was ready for him. Despite her frail appearance, she drove her elbow into his solar plexus with surprising force, breaking free long enough to dart toward the storage unit. Clayton didn't hesitate. He launched himself at the lead man, tackling him before he could draw his weapon. They crashed to the ground, fighting for control of the gun concealed under the man's jacket. Clayton's years of ranch work had given him strength and endurance. But his opponent was clearly trained in combat. Margaret had reached the storage unit and was frantically gathering the most important files. The third man was pursuing her, but she managed to grab the implementation binder and several crucial folders before he caught up. The Lindquist file. She shouted to Clayton as she struggled with her pursuer. "Get the Lindquist file." Clayton broke free from the lead man and dove toward the storage unit, grabbing the folder containing evidence about his great-grandfather's original murder. Behind him, he heard the distinctive click of a gun being cocked. "That's enough," the lead man said, his weapon now drawn and pointed at Clayton's back. "Step away from the files and put your hands where I can see them." Clayton straightened slowly, the Lindquist folder clutched in his hand. Margaret was being held by one of the other men, blood trickling from her nose where she'd been struck. The situation seemed hopeless until Clayton heard the distant wail of sirens approaching the storage facility. The lead man's expression shifted from confidence to concern. "Those sirens aren't for us," he said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. "Actually, they are," Margaret said, managing a smile despite her injuries. "Thomas left instructions with his lawyer that if this storage unit was ever accessed, and if we didn't check in within 4 hours, the lawyer should contact the FBI field office in Denver and request immediate assistance." Clayton felt a surge of hope. Thomas Whitfield had anticipated this exact scenario and built in protection for anyone who tried to use his evidence. The sirens were getting closer, and the lead man was clearly calculating his options. Killing 2 civilians in a storage facility was one thing when you had time to clean up the scene. Doing it with federal agents approaching was an entirely different proposition. "We're leaving," he announced to his associates. "But this isn't over." "Yes, it is," Clayton said, holding up the Lindquist folder. "Whatever authority your network had, whatever protection you enjoyed from corrupt officials, it ends today. These files are going to the FBI, and every family you've destroyed will get justice." The 3 men retreated to their SUV and drove away just as the first FBI vehicles arrived at the storage facility. Clayton and Margaret found themselves surrounded by genuine federal agents, who seemed well informed about the situation and immediately began securing the evidence. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, the lead investigator, explained that the FBI had been conducting a preliminary investigation into historical land fraud in Montana for the past 18 months. Thomas Whitfield's lawyer had provided them with a summary of the evidence, but they'd been waiting for someone with standing to come forward as a witness. "Mr. Murdoch," Agent Torres said as they stood outside the storage unit, "you understand that cooperating with this investigation will essentially mean confessing to crimes committed by your family over several decades." "I understand," Clayton replied. "And I also understand that it's the only way to stop the crimes from continuing." Over the next 6 hours, Clayton and Margaret provided detailed statements to the FBI team. The storage unit was officially secured as evidence in what Agent Torres described as one of the largest historical fraud cases in the Bureau's experience. The evidence would need to be analyzed and verified, but the preliminary assessment suggested that prosecutions could be pursued against current network participants under RICO statutes. "What about the restoration plan?" Clayton asked as the sun set over the storage facility. "Can the land still be returned to the families who were robbed?" Agent Torres nodded. "That's actually the most straightforward part of this case. Once fraud is proven in court, the victims' descendants will have clear legal standing to reclaim their property. The federal government can facilitate those transfers and ensure that everyone is treated fairly." As they drove back toward the ranch that evening, Margaret was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Thomas would be proud of what we accomplished today." "What we accomplished was just the beginning," Clayton replied. "It's going to take years to sort through all the legal challenges and property transfers. And there's no guarantee that everyone in the network will be prosecuted. But the cycle is broken," Margaret said. For the first time in 90 years, the Murdoch name will be associated with justice instead of theft. 3 months later, Clayton stood on the porch of what would soon be his much smaller ranch house. The FBI investigation had resulted in 17 federal indictments, including charges against his longtime lawyer and financial advisor. The corruption network that had protected his family for generations was finally being dismantled. The restoration process was moving faster than anyone had expected. The first property transfers had already been completed, returning 800 acres to the Morrison family's descendants. The Kowalski family, represented by Sarah Chun's surviving relatives, had reclaimed their ancestral homestead. Most remarkably, 2 Lindquist descendants from Minnesota had traveled to Montana to see the land their great-great-grandfather had died for. Clayton's empire had shrunk to its original 640 acres, plus enough assets to live comfortably, but not lavishly. The change was difficult, but not as devastating as he'd feared. For the first time in his life, he could look at his land without wondering what crimes had been committed to acquire it. Margaret had decided to stay in Montana, purchasing a small house in Riverside with money from the sale of her late husband's investigative business. She visited Clayton weekly, both of them serving as witnesses in the ongoing prosecutions and helping coordinate the restoration efforts. "Any regrets?" she asked during one of her visits as they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the Fazula. Significantly smaller Broken Arrow Ranch. Clayton considered the question seriously. He'd lost most of his wealth, his family's reputation was in ruins, and he faced years of legal proceedings related to the crimes committed in his name. But he'd also gained something he'd never had before, the knowledge that his life was built on justice instead of blood. "None," he said finally. "For the first time in 4 generations, a Murdoch can sleep peacefully on this land." Margaret smiled and opened the leather diary one final time. On the last page, she'd written a new entry in her own handwriting. October 15, 2024. Today the cycle finally ended. Clayton Murdoch chose courage over comfort, justice over wealth, truth over the lies his family had lived for 90 years. The land remembers what was done to it, but now it can also remember what was done to heal it. Thomas would say this was what he worked toward his entire life, not revenge, but restoration. Not destruction, but redemption. The starving widow who collapsed on a rancher's porch wasn't seeking charity. She was offering salvation. And for the first time since 1932, the Montana plains can rest in peace. As darkness settled over the ranch, Clayton and Margaret sat in comfortable silence, 2 unlikely allies who had found the courage to break a cycle of violence that had persisted for nearly a century. The cost had been enormous, but the price of continuing the pattern would have been far greater. Behind them, the ranch house stood solid and enduring, finally built on an honest foundation. And in the distance, lights flickered in the homes of families who had reclaimed their heritage, their history, and their hope for the future. 1 year after the confrontation at the storage facility, Clayton received a phone call that would test everything he'd learned about his family's legacy. The caller was Dr. Amanda Prescott, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Montana, and her news was both disturbing and oddly vindicating. "Mr. Murdoch, we've made a discovery on your property that you need to know about immediately," Dr. Prescott said. "Can you meet us at the old mining shaft about 2 miles north of your main house?" Clayton had always known about the abandoned shaft, a relic from early prospecting efforts that had preceded the homestead era. His father had warned him to stay away from it as a child, claiming it was unstable and dangerous. Now as he drove his ATV across the familiar terrain, he wondered what the university team had uncovered. The scene at the mining shaft was like something from a crime drama. A team of forensic specialists had erected a canvas shelter over the opening, and sophisticated excavation equipment surrounded the site. Dr. Prescott, a woman in her 40s with prematurely gray hair and intense blue eyes, met Clayton as he approached. "Mr. Murdoch, We're here because of information provided by the FBI investigation into your family's activities," she explained. One of the witnesses who came forward mentioned that several missing persons from the 1930s and 1940s might have been disposed of in remote locations on the ranch property. Clayton felt his stomach drop. The storage unit evidence had documented murders, but finding actual bodies would make the crimes undeniably real in a way that paperwork never could. "What have you found?" Dr. Prescott led him to the edge of the excavation site. "So far, we've recovered the remains of 7 individuals. Preliminary examination suggests they died between 1932 and 1945. All show signs of violent death, gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma. This appears to have been a systematic disposal site." Clayton stared into the excavation, seeing the carefully marked areas where human remains had been discovered. Each skeleton was being painstakingly documented, photographed, and prepared for removal. The scientific precision of the work couldn't disguise the horror of what had been hidden in his family's land for 8 decades. "Can you identify any of them? That's why I called you. We found this with one of the bodies." Dr. Prescott held up an evidence bag containing a tarnished pocket watch. The inscription reads, "To Eric Lindquist from your loving wife Anna, 1886. We believe this confirms the identity of one victim." The name hit Clayton like a physical blow. Eric Lindquist, the Swedish immigrant whose homestead land had become the foundation of the Murdoch Ranch. Not only had his great-grandfather murdered the man, but he'd thrown his body down a mine shaft like garbage. "Dr. Prescott, I know who that is. Eric Lindquist was the original owner of this land. My great-grandfather forged documents claiming to have purchased the property legitimately, but we now know he murdered Lindquist and stole his homestead claim. The FBI briefed us on the broader investigation," Dr. Prescott said. "What makes this discovery particularly significant is that we can now prove murder charges that previously existed only on paper. These remains provide physical evidence that could be used to overturn every property transfer that resulted from the original crime." As they spoke, one of the forensic technicians called out from the excavation site, "Dr. Prescott, you need to see this. We've found something unusual with victim number 4. They approached the technician, who was carefully brushing dirt away from a partially exposed skeleton. This individual was wearing what appears to be a sheriff's badge. The corrosion is significant, but we can make out enough detail to suggest it's from the 1930s era. Clayton felt the world spin around him. A sheriff's badge meant that one of the victims was a law enforcement officer. Could this be Sheriff Morrison? Dr. Prescott consulted a folder containing historical research. According to the records we've reviewed, Sheriff William Morrison disappeared in 1938. He was reportedly investigating irregularities in local property transfers before his disappearance. His replacement was appointed by the county commissioners and served until 1962. Let me guess, his replacement was on my great-grandfather's payroll. That appears to be the case. Sheriff Morrison's disappearance effectively ended official resistance to the Murdoch land acquisition scheme. Clayton walked away from the excavation site, overwhelmed by the accumulating evidence of his family's depravity. Every revelation seemed to reveal new depths of criminality, new victims whose lives had been snuffed out to protect the growing empire. His phone rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. The caller was Margaret Whitfield, her voice excited despite the somber subject matter. "Clayton, I just received a call from Agent Torres. The grand jury has returned indictments against 12 more people connected to the network. They're finally going after the political figures who provided protection." "That's good news," Clayton replied, though his tone didn't match his words. "Margaret, they found bodies on the ranch. 7 people murdered and threw down a mine shaft like they were nothing." The line went quiet for a long moment. "Oh, Clayton, I'm so sorry." Thomas always suspected there might be physical evidence somewhere on the property, but we never knew where to look. One of them is Eric Lindquist, the man whose land my family stole to establish the ranch. Another appears to be Sheriff Morrison, who was investigating the property fraud before he disappeared. Sheriff Morrison, Margaret repeated softly. Thomas found references to him in some of the old documents, but we never knew what happened to him. Now we do. My great-grandfather murdered a law enforcement officer to cover up his crimes. Margaret's voice grew stronger. Clayton, I know this is horrific, but it also provides the final piece of evidence needed to completely dismantle the network. Physical proof of murder will make it impossible for anyone to claim the property transfers were legitimate business transactions. Dr. Prescott approached, having overheard part of Clayton's conversation. Mr. Murdoch, there's something else you should know. We found evidence that this site was used for disposal as recently as the 1980s. Some of these remains are much more recent than the others. Clayton's blood ran cold. The 1980s meant his father's era, the time when Robert Murdoch was supposedly transitioning the family business toward more legitimate operations. How recent? We'll need laboratory analysis to be certain, but preliminary examination suggests at least 2 individuals died within the past 40 years. One appears to have been killed by a high-powered rifle, which is consistent with hunting accident scenarios that were commonly used to explain disappearances during that period. Clayton thought about the hunting accidents his father had mentioned. Over the years, tragic mishaps that had befallen neighbors who ventured into the wrong areas of the ranch. He'd never questioned these stories, accepting them as unfortunate but inevitable consequences of living in rural Montana. Dr. Prescott, how many more bodies do you expect to find? The ground-penetrating radar suggests there may be as many as 15 individuals buried at this site. We'll know more as the excavation continues, but it appears your family used this location as a primary disposal site for several decades. The scope of the murders was staggering. Clayton had grown up playing on land that contained the remains of people his family had killed. He'd ridden his horse over graves, hunted deer near a mass burial site, considered this ground part of his peaceful inheritance. There's more, Dr. Prescott continued. We've also found evidence of systematic evidence disposal. Burned documents, destroyed personal effects, items that were probably taken from victims' homes after their murders. Your great-grandfather was very thorough in eliminating traces of his crimes. Clayton's phone rang again. This time the caller was his lawyer, his new lawyer, since his previous legal representation was awaiting trial on federal conspiracy charges. Clayton, we have a problem, Attorney Jennifer Walsh said without preamble. I just received word that the Lindquist family descendants are filing a civil lawsuit seeking to recover not just the original homestead land, but damages for wrongful death and 90 years of lost property income. How much are they seeking? $47 million, plus the return of all property acquired through the original theft. If they win, you could lose everything, including the remaining 640 acres. Clayton looked around the excavation site, where forensic specialists continued their grim work of documenting his family's victims. Jennifer, they found Eric Lindquist's body in a mine shaft on the ranch, along with 6 other murder victims. I don't think fighting this lawsuit is the right approach. Clayton, I understand the emotional impact of these discoveries, but you need to think practically. Even if your ancestors committed these crimes, you can't be held responsible for events that happened before you were born, can't I? Clayton watched as technicians carefully lifted another set of remains from the excavation. Jennifer, these people were murdered so my family could steal their land. I've been living off the proceeds of those murders my entire life. If that doesn't create some kind of moral obligation, then the legal system is more broken than I thought. Moral obligation and legal liability are 2 different things. Maybe they shouldn't be. Clayton ended the call and walked back to where Margaret was standing near the excavation. She'd driven out from Riverside after hearing about the discovery, and her presence was comforting in the midst of so much horror. "Margaret, my lawyer, thinks I should fight the Lindquist lawsuit. What do you think?" Clayton considered the question. While watching the forensic team work, each bone they uncovered represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, dreams that had died with their dreamers. The Lindquist descendants weren't seeking revenge. They were seeking justice for an ancestor who'd been murdered for his land. "I think the Lindquist family has waited 90 years for justice. I think fighting them would make me no better than the rest of my family." Margaret smiled sadly. "That's exactly what Thomas hoped you would say. Your husband predicted this too. He predicted that when the physical evidence was finally discovered, you would face pressure to protect what remained of your inheritance through legal maneuvering. He believed you would choose justice over self-preservation." Dr. Prescott approached them again, her expression grave. "Mr. Murdoch, we've made another discovery. One of the victims appears to have been a woman and child, mother and daughter. Based on the bone structure and positioning, Clayton felt physically ill. The murders hadn't been limited to men who posed direct threats to the land acquisition scheme. His family had killed women and children. Do we know who they were? We found this near the remains." Dr. Prescott held up another evidence bag, this one containing a small locket. "It's too corroded to open safely, but X-ray analysis shows there are photographs inside. We may be able to identify them once the locket is properly conserved." Clayton stared at the locket, imagining the woman who had worn it, the child who had died alongside her. What threat could a mother and daughter have posed to justify such brutality? "Dr. Prescott, I want to make a public statement about these discoveries." Margaret looked surprised. "Clayton, your lawyer would strongly advise against that. My lawyer thinks I should fight to keep land that was acquired through murder. I think the public has a right to know what my family did, and the victims' families have a right to see justice." Dr. Prescott nodded approvingly. "Mr. Murdoch, that would be unprecedented in a case like this. Usually, property owners do everything possible to minimize their liability." "I'm not interested in being usual," Clayton replied. "I want to hold a press conference right here at the excavation site. I want people to see what 90 years of crime looks like when it's finally brought into the light." Margaret placed her hand on his arm. "Clayton, are you certain about this? Once you make a public confession, there's no taking it back. Every lawsuit, every criminal charge, every claim against your family's estate will be strengthened by your own words." "Good," Clayton said firmly. "Maybe it's time for Murdoch to finally tell the truth, regardless of the consequences." 3 days later, Clayton stood before a gathering of reporters, FBI agents, forensic specialists, and family members of the victims. The excavation site had been expanded to accommodate the media presence, but the work continued in the background, as a grim reminder of why they were all there. "My name is Clayton Murdoch," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the Montana air. "For 4 generations, my family has been considered pillars of this community. We've been praised for our business success, our charitable contributions, and our stewardship of one of the region's largest ranches. Today, I'm here to tell you that everything you've been told about my family is a lie." The crowd of reporters pressed closer, cameras rolling and notebooks ready. This was not the usual carefully crafted corporate statement they'd expected. The Murdoch Ranch was built on murder, theft, and systematic corruption spanning nearly a century. The evidence being uncovered at this site represents just a fraction of the crimes committed to build and maintain our family's wealth. Clayton gestured toward the excavation, where forensic specialists continued their work. "These people were murdered because they stood in the way of my great-grandfather's land acquisition scheme. They were shot, beaten to death, and thrown into a mine shaft like garbage. Their families spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones, never knowing they'd been killed by people they trusted." A reporter called out a question about legal liability, but Clayton continued without pausing. I stand here today, not to defend my family's actions, but to confess them. Every acre of land beyond the original 640-acre homestead was acquired through fraud, intimidation, or murder. Every dollar of wealth my family accumulated was built on the suffering of innocent people. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her face. This was the moment Thomas had dreamed of. Murdoch publicly acknowledging the truth and accepting responsibility for generations of crimes. The restoration process that began 1 year ago will continue and expand, Clayton announced. Every family that was harmed by my ancestors will receive justice. Every acre of stolen land will be returned. Every dollar of ill-gotten wealth will be used to compensate the victims. Clayton paused, looking directly into the cameras. To the families of the people buried at this site, I offer not just an apology, but a promise. Your loved ones will be properly identified, properly buried, and properly honored. Their deaths will not be forgotten, and their killers will finally be held accountable, even if that accountability comes 90 years too late. As the press conference ended and reporters rushed to file their stories, Clayton stood alone at the edge of the excavation site. The forensic team had covered the remains for the night, but tomorrow they would continue their work, giving names and dignity back to people who had been treated as obstacles to overcome. Margaret approached, her expression mixing pride and sorrow. Clayton, you've done something remarkable today. You've given those victims their voices back. It's not enough, Clayton replied. Nothing I do will bring them back or undo the suffering my family caused, but maybe it's a start. In the distance, the lights of the Broken Arrow ranch house twinkled in the gathering darkness. Soon, that house would belong to someone else, along with most of the land that surrounded it. Clayton would start over with almost nothing, but for the first time in his life, that nothing would be honestly earned. The excavation would continue for another month, ultimately revealing the remains of 14 individuals murdered between 1932 and 1984. Each victim would be identified, properly buried, and honored with memorial services attended by their surviving family members. The Murdoch Ranch would be divided among 7 families, returning land to its rightful owners for the first time in nearly a century. And in a small cemetery in Riverside, a new headstone would be erected for Eric Lindquist, the Swedish immigrant, who had dreamed of building a life in Montana and instead became the first victim of a criminal dynasty that finally, after 90 years of blood and lies, had been brought to justice. 2 years after Clayton's public confession, this story took an unexpected turn that would challenge everything he thought he knew about redemption and forgiveness. The call came on a February morning when the Montana landscape was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, transforming the ranch into a pristine wilderness that masked its dark history. The caller identified herself as Dr. Elena Vasquez, a documentary filmmaker from the University of California who had been following the Murdoch case for her upcoming film about generational trauma and historical justice. But her reason for calling wasn't what Clayton expected. Mr. Murdoch, I've been investigating your family's crimes for the past 18 months, and I've discovered something that changes the entire narrative, Dr. Vasquez said, her voice carrying an urgency that immediately captured Clayton's attention. Clayton was living in a modest cabin he'd built on the remaining 5 acres of land he'd kept after the restoration process. The original 640 acres had been returned to the Lindquist family, along with most of his remaining assets used to establish a victim compensation fund. He'd chosen to start completely over rather than profit from any land connected to his family's crimes. What kind of discovery? Clayton asked, setting down his coffee mug. I've found evidence that suggests your great-grandfather Silas wasn't the originator of the criminal network. He was recruited into an existing operation that was already stealing land from homesteaders across the Western Territories. The statement hit Clayton like a physical blow. For 2 years, he'd lived with the belief that Silas Murdoch was the architect of the criminal empire. The evil genius who had conceived and implemented this systematic theft and murder. The idea that Silas might have been following someone else's blueprint challenged his understanding of his family's role in the conspiracy. Dr. Vasquez, I think you should explain this in person. Can you come to Montana? I'm already here. I've been working with the Tribal Council of the Crow Nation, and what we've uncovered suggests that the land theft operation was part of a much larger conspiracy involving railroad companies, mining interests, and federal officials. 3 hours later, Dr. Vasquez arrived at Clayton's cabin, accompanied by Joseph Running Bear, a historian and cultural preservation specialist from the Crow Nation. Running Bear carried a leather satchel that he handled with obvious reverence, suggesting it contained materials of significant historical importance. Dr. Vasquez was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their surroundings. Running Bear appeared to be in his 40s, with the weathered features of someone who spent considerable time outdoors and the quiet dignity that Clayton had learned to associate with people who had survived historical trauma. Mr. Murdoch, Running Bear began, before we show you what we found, I need you to understand something. The crimes committed against homesteading families like the Caldwells and Kowalskis were part of a larger pattern of violence against indigenous peoples that began long before your great-grandfather was born. Clayton invited them inside, where they spread documents across his small kitchen table. The papers were copies of federal correspondence, railroad company memos, and mining company records dating back to the 1870s. What you're looking at, Dr. Vasquez explained, is evidence of a coordinated effort to remove both Native American tribes and homesteading families from land that contained valuable mineral deposits. The railroad companies wanted the territory for expansion, mining companies wanted access to coal and copper deposits, and federal officials wanted to clear the land for development. Running Bear opened his satchel and withdrew a bundle of photographs showing Native American settlements, many of which Clayton recognized as locations that later became part of various ranches in the region. The Crow Nation had settlements throughout this valley until the late 1880s, Running Bear continued. We were forcibly relocated to make way for homesteaders, who were then systematically driven off the land by people like your great-grandfather. The entire process was orchestrated by outside interests who used local operators to do their dirty work. Clayton studied the documents, seeing names he didn't recognize but patterns that were disturbingly familiar. Letters between railroad executives discussed the need to clear obstacles from valuable territory. Mining company correspondence referred to eliminating complications that prevented resource extraction. Federal officials wrote about relocating populations to facilitate development. You're saying my great-grandfather was hired to steal the land? We're saying he was recruited into a criminal organization that was already operating throughout the Western Territories, Dr. Vasquez replied. Silas Murdoch wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was middle management in a conspiracy that stretched from California to Montana and involved some of the most powerful business interests in the country. Running Bear pulled out a map showing the original extent of Crow Nation territory in the region. Nearly every acre that had later been stolen by the Murdoch family had originally belonged to his people. The pattern was always the same, Running Bear explained. First, federal troops would force native tribes off their ancestral lands. Then homesteaders would be encouraged to settle the territory with promises of fertile soil and mineral wealth. Finally, local operators like your great-grandfather would drive off the homesteaders through violence and fraud, consolidating the land for sale to railroad and mining companies. Clayton felt a new kind of horror settling over him. The crimes he'd been grappling with for 2 years were apparently just one small part of a much larger conspiracy that had destroyed multiple cultures and communities. Do you have proof of this connection? Dr. Vasquez opened another folder and withdrew a series of bank records. These documents show payments from the Northern Pacific Railroad to accounts controlled by Silas Murdoch. The payments coincide exactly with major land acquisitions and the disappearances of families who refused to sell their property. The railroad was paying him to commit murder. The railroad was paying him to acquire land by whatever means necessary. They maintained plausible deniability about the methods used, but the payment schedule makes their complicity clear. Running Bear spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of generational grief. Mr. Murdoch, your family's crimes were terrible, but they were also symptomatic of a larger system of violence that was used to steal an entire continent from its original inhabitants. What happened to the homesteading families was horrific, but it was part of the same process that destroyed hundreds of native communities. Clayton looked around his modest cabin, thinking about the comfortable guilt he'd been living with for the past 2 years. He'd believed that by confessing his family's crimes and returning stolen land, he was making meaningful amends for historical injustices. Now he was learning that those crimes were part of a much larger pattern of violence that he'd never even considered. What happened to the land after my great-grandfather acquired it? Was it sold to the railroad companies? Dr. Vasquez consulted her documents. That's where the story gets more complicated. The railroad companies and mining interests that financed the land theft operation went through a series of mergers and acquisitions in the early 1900s. Many of them eventually became part of larger corporations that still exist today. You mean the companies that paid for these murders are still operating? Not just operating, thriving. Several of the corporations that benefited from the original land theft have become major players in modern energy development, real estate, and transportation. They've built billion-dollar empires on land that was acquired through genocide and murder. Running Bear spread out a modern map showing current corporate landholdings in the region. These energy companies that are fracking and mining throughout Montana are, in many cases, the direct descendants of the corporations that paid your great-grandfather to steal this land. The implications were staggering. Clayton had spent 2 years believing that his family's crimes were historical aberrations, terrible events that could be addressed through individual confession and restitution. Now he was learning that those crimes were part of an ongoing system of exploitation that continued to profit from historical violence. Dr. Vasquez, what exactly are you proposing? The railroad companies and mining interests that hired my great-grandfather have been dead for over a century. The companies are dead, but their successors inherited both the benefits and the liability of their crimes. Just as you inherited the moral obligation to address your family's role in the conspiracy, these modern corporations have inherited the obligation to address their predecessors' role. Clayton walked to his window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape where so much violence had occurred. In the distance, he could see the lights of a natural gas processing facility that had been built on land, originally stolen from the Crow Nation and later taken from homesteading families. What kind of evidence would be needed to prove corporate liability for crimes committed over a century ago? Running Bear smiled grimly. We have more evidence than you might think. Tribal oral histories, federal correspondence, corporate records, and most importantly, continuous harm that extends from the original crimes to the present day. Continuous harm? The land theft didn't end with your great-grandfather's death, Dr. Vasquez explained. The pattern continued throughout the 20th century, with modern corporations using legal and financial manipulation to acquire native lands and drive small farmers off their property. The methods became more sophisticated, but the essential business model remained the same. Clayton felt the familiar weight of moral responsibility settling on his shoulders again, but this time it was heavier and more complex than before. The confession and restitution that had seemed so meaningful 2 years earlier now appeared to be addressing only the surface level of a much deeper problem. What do you want from me? We want you to help us expose the full scope of the conspiracy, Running Bear said. Your public confession 2 years ago gave voice to the families who were murdered for their land. Now we need your help to hold accountable the corporations that profited from those murders." Dr. Vasquez added, "Clayton, you've proven that individual accountability is possible, even for historical crimes. Now we need to prove that corporate accountability is also possible. What would that look like practically?" Running Bear opened his satchel again and withdrew a thick legal document. "We've been working with attorneys who specialize in corporate liability for historical crimes. They believe we can file lawsuits against the successor corporations under theories of unjust enrichment and continuing conspiracy." "How many corporations are we talking about?" 17 major companies that can be directly traced back to the original conspiracy. Their combined annual revenue exceeds $200 billion. Clayton felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were proposing. Taking on 17 major corporations would make his family's confession look like a minor legal dispute. Even if we could prove liability, what kind of remedy would be appropriate? You can't return stolen land that's now covered with cities and industrial facilities. "We're not seeking to return every acre of stolen land," Dr. Vasquez explained. "We're seeking acknowledgement of the crimes, public apology from the responsible corporations, and a combination of financial compensation and land transfer that would allow Native communities and descendant families to rebuild what was destroyed." Running Bear pulled out another document, this one showing proposed settlement terms. "The Crow Nation has identified 50,000 acres of currently held corporate land that includes sacred sites and historically significant locations. We're seeking the return of that land, plus financial compensation for 150 years of lost revenue and cultural destruction." "And the homesteader families?" "Similar terms, land return where possible, financial compensation where land return isn't feasible, and funding for cultural and historical preservation programs." Clayton studied the settlement proposal, impressed by its comprehensiveness and intimidated by its scope. The corporations would be required to acknowledge their historical crimes, return significant amounts of land, pay billions in compensation, and fund ongoing programs to address the continuing effects of historical trauma. This would be the largest corporate accountability case in American history, Clayton said. "Which is why we need your help," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Your confession and cooperation 2 years ago broke open a conspiracy that had been hidden for 90 years. Now we need you to help us trace that conspiracy to its modern manifestations." Running Bear leaned forward, his expression intense. "Mr. Murdoch, your great-grandfather was a criminal, but he was also a victim of a system that used people like him to commit crimes that benefited much more powerful interests. You have the opportunity to expose that system and hold those interests accountable." Clayton walked back to the table where the documents were spread, thinking about the moral complexity of what he was being asked to do. 2 years earlier, he'd thought confession and individual restitution would be sufficient to address his family's crimes. Now he was learning that those crimes were part of a web of exploitation that extended far beyond anything he'd imagined. "If I agree to help with this investigation, what exactly would be required?" "Access to the remaining Murdoch family records, testimony about your knowledge of the corporate connections, and willingness to serve as a lead plaintiff in the lawsuit against the successor corporations," Dr. Vasquez explained. "Lead plaintiff? Your name and story have become symbols of accountability for historical crimes. Having you as the primary plaintiff would give the case credibility and media attention that it wouldn't otherwise receive." Clayton looked out the window again, watching snow fall on land that had been fought over, stolen, and fought over again. For more than a century, the cycle of violence and exploitation seemed endless, with each generation finding new ways to profit from the crimes of their predecessors. "Dr. Vasquez, Mr. Running Bear, I've spent 2 years learning about the limitations of individual redemption. Maybe it's time to find out about the possibilities of collective justice. Running Bear smiled for the first time since arriving. Mr. Murdoch, that's exactly what we hoped you would say. As the afternoon light faded over the Montana landscape, Clayton signed his name to documents that would launch the most ambitious corporate accountability case in American legal history. The starving widow who had collapsed on his porch 3 years earlier had set in motion events that would ultimately challenge not just one family's crimes, but an entire system of exploitation that had shaped the American West. The battle ahead would be longer, more complex, and more dangerous than anything Clayton had faced before. But for the first time since Margaret Whitfield had appeared on his porch, he felt like he was fighting for something larger than just his own redemption. He was fighting for a future where historical crimes could no longer hide behind corporate shields and where justice might finally reach the most powerful perpetrators of historical violence. 5 years after Margaret Whitfield collapsed on Clayton Murdoch's porch, the federal courthouse in Helena, Montana became the stage for a legal battle that would redefine corporate accountability in America. The case of Running Bear v. Northern Energy Consortium had drawn international attention, with Clayton serving as the star witness in a lawsuit that sought to hold 17 major corporations liable for crimes committed over a century earlier. The courtroom was packed with representatives from Native American tribes, descendants of murdered homesteaders, corporate lawyers in expensive suits, and journalists from around the world. Margaret Whitfield, now 87 and using a wheelchair, sat in the front row beside Joseph Running Bear, and Dr. Elena Vasquez. Clayton took the witness stand wearing a simple black suit, a far cry from the wealthy rancher who had once controlled 15,000 acres of stolen land. As lead plaintiff, his testimony would be crucial in establishing the connection between historical crimes and modern corporate liability. "Mr. Murdoch," began Sarah Chun's cousin, attorney Lisa Nakamura, who had volunteered to prosecute the case. "Pro bono, please tell the court how you first learned about your family's crimes." Clayton looked directly at Margaret, whose presence had started this entire journey. "It began when a starving widow collapsed on my porch. I thought I was helping a stranger in need. I had no idea she was offering me salvation." Over the next 6 hours, Clayton methodically detailed every revelation from the past 5 years. The diary entries document systematic harassment. The storage unit is filled with evidence of 90 years of crime. The mass grave contains 14 murder victims. The corporate payments that proved his great-grandfather was working for railroad and mining interests. The defense attorneys, representing corporations with names like Continental Resources, Western Mining Enterprises, and Pacific Rail Holdings, argued that their clients couldn't be held responsible for crimes committed by long-dead predecessor companies. They claimed the statute of limitations had expired, that corporate succession didn't transfer criminal liability, and that the evidence was too old to be reliable. But the prosecution had prepared for these arguments. Dr. Vasquez presented evidence showing continuous harm extending from the original crimes to the present day. Land that had been stolen from the Crow Nation in the 1880s was still being exploited by successor corporations for fracking operations. Families descended from murdered homesteaders remained impoverished while corporations built on stolen land generated billions in annual revenue. The breakthrough moment came when Joseph Running Bear took the stand. Speaking in both English and Crow, he presented oral histories that had been passed down through 5 generations, describing the systematic violence used to drive his people from their ancestral lands. "The corporations say these crimes are too old to matter," Running Bear testified. "But every day my people drive past fracking wells and mining operations on land that belonged to our ancestors. Every day we see corporations profiting from violence committed against our families. The crimes aren't historical, they're ongoing." Margaret's testimony proved to be the most powerful moment of the trial. Despite her frail condition, her voice was strong as she read from her mother's diary one final time. "The land remembers what was done to it. but perhaps it can also remember what was done to heal it. She looked directly at the corporate defense table. For 90 years, these companies and their predecessors have profited from murder, theft, and genocide. Today, finally, the land will remember justice. The corporate lawyers fought viciously, filing motion after motion to dismiss the case, challenging every piece of evidence, and bringing in expert witnesses to dispute the historical record. They argued that holding modern corporations responsible for historical crimes would destroy the American economy and create unlimited liability for past actions. But Judge Maria Santos, a federal judge with deep experience in complex civil rights cases, allowed the trial to proceed. If corporations can inherit the benefits of historical crimes, she ruled, they can also inherit the liability. The trial lasted 8 months. Corporate executives were forced to testify about their companies' knowledge of their criminal origins. Internal documents revealed that several corporations had been aware of their connection to historical land theft but had chosen to hide the evidence rather than address it. The most damaging testimony came from a whistleblower within Continental Resources who revealed that the company had discovered evidence of the original conspiracy in the 1970s, but had buried the information to avoid liability. They had even hired private investigators to monitor families like the Whitfields who might pose a threat to their interests. When the verdicts were finally read, the courtroom erupted in cheers and tears. The jury found all 17 corporations liable for unjust enrichment, continuing conspiracy, and violations of federal civil rights laws. The damages awarded totaled $47 billion, the largest civil rights judgment in American history. But more importantly than the money was the court's order, requiring each corporation to publicly acknowledge their role in historical crimes, return specified lands to native tribes and descendant families, and fund educational programs about the true history of Western expansion. Continental Resources was ordered to return 25,000 acres to the Crow Nation, including sacred sites that had been used for mining operations. Western Mining Enterprises was required to pay $8 billion in compensation to families of murdered homesteaders. Pacific Rail Holdings was forced to fund the construction of cultural centers and museums, documenting the crimes committed to build their transportation network. As Clayton stood outside the courthouse after the verdict, surrounded by reporters and cameras, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 5 years earlier, he'd been a wealthy rancher living off stolen land. Now he was a man of modest means who had helped expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American history. "Mr. Murdoch," called out a reporter, "do you have any regrets about destroying your family's empire?" Clayton looked across the street where Margaret sat in her wheelchair, smiling despite her exhaustion. Behind her, Joseph Running Bear was speaking with tribal elders who had traveled from the reservation to witness the verdict. Dr. Vasquez was already planning the documentary that would tell this story to the world. "I didn't destroy my family's empire," Clayton replied. "I helped reveal what it actually was, a criminal organization built on the bones of innocent people. What we destroyed today wasn't an empire. It was a lie that had been told for over a century." The appeals process would take another 2 years, but the corporations eventually settled rather than risk having the verdict upheld, and the case becoming permanent legal precedent. The final settlement required $52 billion in payments and land transfers, along with the establishment of a permanent foundation to address ongoing effects of historical trauma. Margaret Whitfield died peacefully in her sleep 6 months after the trial ended. Clayton spoke at her funeral, held in the small cemetery in Riverside where her parents were buried, alongside the other families who had been driven from their homes in 1932. Margaret could have lived quietly with her family's secret, Clayton told the gathered mourners. Instead, she chose to walk 30 miles across dangerous terrain to give one man the chance to choose differently than his ancestors. Her courage didn't just save my soul, it saved the souls of corporations, governments, and communities that had forgotten the difference between profit and justice. Clayton now works as a consultant helping other communities investigate historical land fraud and corporate accountability. He lives simply, owns no property beyond his modest cabin, and has donated every dollar he's earned from speaking engagements and book deals to victims' rights organizations. The Broken Arrow Ranch no longer exists. The original homestead where Eric Lindquist was murdered has been returned to his descendants, who have established a museum documenting the true history of settlement in the American West. The mass grave where 14 victims were buried has become a memorial garden where families can honor their ancestors, who died for refusing to surrender their dreams. On quiet evenings, Clayton often walks the 5 acres he kept for himself, the only land he owns that was never stolen from anyone. As he watches the sunset over the Montana plains, he sometimes thinks about the starving widow who appeared on his porch like a messenger from history itself. Margaret Whitfield had collapsed from hunger and exhaustion, but she had carried with her something more powerful than food or medicine. She had carried the truth, wrapped in a leather diary and secured with her mother's dying wish that justice would eventually prevail. The land remembers everything, the violence committed upon it, the lies told to justify that violence, and the courage required to finally speak the truth. In Montana, where the wind carries stories across vast distances and the mountains stand as eternal witnesses, the land now remembers something new, that even the darkest legacies can be transformed when ordinary people find extraordinary courage to do what's right. The cycle that began with murder and theft in 1889 finally ended with confession and restoration in 2029. And somewhere in the Montana wind, the voices of Eric Lindquist, Eleanor Caldwell, Thomas Whitfield, and Margaret herself whisper their approval. Justice delayed, but never denied. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.